Hello and welcome to today's lesson on Russia. Now this will be pretty much our final lesson, and at this point we will have finished all of the content of the Russia aspect of your A-level. So let's pick up with a quick recap. Think about topic 4. So from the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917 through to 1924. How did the Bolsheviks consolidate power during that period? Try and create a list now. Maybe 3, 4, 5 different things you can think of. Some ideas that you might have come up with could include the creation of a single party state, the Red Terror, the Civil War, the Cheka, the silencing of opposition to Lenin within the Bolshevik Party itself, the expulsion of the SRs. There's lots of different things you might have thrown out as an idea there. Today we're going to look further at what was happening in political terms during the period of the NEP, of their new economic policy. And we'll be asking, did the liberalisation of the economy, which took place during the NEP, also lead to political liberalisation? So, let's just stop for a moment and think about this term, liberalisation. So, liberal means free in this context. So, liberalisation, a freeing up. Now, the first thing I'd like you to do is have a look at the ban on factions. Turn to page 372 in your textbook. Let's start by thinking, what is a faction? Now, faction is an organised group within a political body. So you get sort of like more left-wing, more right-wing factions within a political party. Now, the ban on factions was introduced in 1921. It's important to understand the circumstances, and then you get an understanding of why it was introduced. So it was introduced in 1921, just after war communism had been abolished and they were moving into the NEP. Now, the NEP saw the creation of the NEP men, this group of capitalists who were getting rich quick from selling goods on the newly reopened markets, and then they were splashing their cash around, spending it in nightclubs, on fancy clothes, etc. So these net men became very hated, and they became a symbol of the wrongs of capitalism. So the introduction of the NEP and the development of these net men led to lots of people within the Bolshevik Party starting to criticise the direction that was being taken. Lots of Bolsheviks felt that the NEP was a betrayal of their communist ideology. As this criticism grew, Lenin decided the only way to deal with it was to respond by stifling it. So at the 10th Party Congress, he introduced the ban on factions. This dissolved any existing groups within the Bolshevik Party. So any factions that were slightly more left-wing or slightly more right-wing, led by different figures, for example, like Bukharin led one faction. Now, by dissolving all these different factions, you get rid of any competition within the Bolshevik Party and any difference of thought. So everyone has to think like Lenin and do what Lenin was telling them. It ended the plurality of thought within the Bolshevik Party. It ended the culture of open debate about what direction the Bolsheviks should take. Now they were simply going to follow Lenin, no questions asked. The two groups who were really targeted by the ban on factions was the democratic centralists, who deplored the increasingly bureaucratic nature of Bolshevism, and the workers' opposition, who disliked the way in which the return to one-man management under war communism had weakened the influence of the trade unions. However, the ban on factions also led to a much wider major purge of the party's membership. On the eve of the introduction of the NEP, there were 730,000 party members, but by early 1923, this figure had shrunk to 500,000. The message to the survivors of the purge was clear. The decisions of the party leadership had to be accepted without question. By 1924, the Soviet Union was an oligarchy. Its rulers were accountable to no one. In the early days of Bolshevik rule, Sovnarkom was answerable to the Congress of Soviets, composed of delegates elected by city and provincial Soviets, and its Central Executive Committee. Before long, however, Soviet elections became a charade, as Russia became a one-party state, and Sovnarkom and other state institutions, such as government departments, were increasingly marginalised. Bolshevik party bodies grew in power at the expense of institutions of the Soviet state. The Bolshevik Party's political bureau, or Politburo, emerged as the key decision-making body. With the erosion of the internal party democracy after the ban on factions, its decisions could not be challenged by ordinary party members. The Bolsheviks feared that the economic liberalisation that took place during the NEP would lead to the assumption that a similar freeing up politically would also occur. However, that's absolutely not what we see in this period. We see greater political repression during the period of the NEP. The ban on factions demonstrates the tightening of Lenin's control of the Bolsheviks and the kind of lessening of democracy even within the party, so that it's just one voice and no dissent is allowed at all. This is further seen in attacks on political rivals, particularly against the SRs, who had, at the very start in 1917, sort of been supporters of the Bolsheviks. We see the introduction of show trials, which become like the great symbol of the Stalinist terrors of the 1930s, where basically trumped-up charges were introduced to rid yourself of political opponents. We get a tightening of ideas being expressed in the press, as well as greater censorship laws are introduced, and this is through Galvit and censorship pre-publication. This is a crushing of the Russian intelligentsia, so again you have that one single voice instead of many different voices, and it's getting rid of dissent. Of course, you know already that the peasants were cruelly crushed after their opposition to war communism. The best example of this is the Tambov rebellion. I mean, the violence used in crushing those peasants, for example, using gas on them, perhaps it demonstrates the Soviets' lack of compassion for their own people. That becomes so well known throughout the 30s and 40s and so on. Now, the church had kind of been ignored, really, I suppose, by the Bolsheviks. Not ignored as such, but the attacks on them had mainly been like propaganda attacks, whereas now there was a real attack on the church in terms of stripping the wealth of the church and setting up specific bodies to do this. We get the creation of perhaps the best named Soviet division, the Union of the Militant Godless, who are attacking the churches to take away their wealth. Of course, we know that the Marxist thought particularly hated the church because it was thought that the church for centuries had been stealing the wealth of the people and keeping them poor. Marx very famously said, "Religion is the opiate of the masses." And the final thing to discuss is the establishment of the GPU. So the checker was renamed at this point. It gets renamed a lot throughout this period. You probably know the checker best as like the NKVD, probably. Of course, it becomes the KGB, FSB today. They're all basically the same thing. So you know already from the Red Terror some of the actions taken by this police force within Russia. So, to summarise, how did the Bolsheviks ensure support after 1921? Well, just like any dictatorship, the Bolsheviks used both the carrot and the stick. So the Nazis had the Gestapo and propaganda. These guys had the checker, or the GPU, and the stick as well. So they had the carrot, that was the economic liberalisation, the improvement in people's standard of living during the NEP, which helped stop the peasant and worker riots and uprisings. However, they had the stick to keep them under control, which was the political repression, the show trials, the terror, the attacks on the church, and all of this censorship. This was kind of seen as a way of limiting expectations, I suppose, of the Russian people, so that they wouldn't expect political liberalisation just because some elements of capitalism had been reintroduced. So now we're going to look at how the Bolshevik state was organised in 1924. By 1924, Russia was a highly centralised state. That means all decisions about the governance of the country were taken by a small number of people in Moscow. So it's like Moscow is ruling the rest of the country, and there's very little autonomy for the provinces of Russia. Sovnarka was the government of Russia, but increasingly all decisions were just being taken by the Politburo, which I guess is like a cabinet, so a small number of individuals at the very heart of the Russian state. One thing to watch to give you a sense of the Politburo is the death of Stalin. That shows you quite a comedic view of some of the crazy dynamics within the Politburo itself. This centralisation and concentration of power in the hands of a few is kind of a key Bolshevik trait. You see it there all the time, that they're trying to control the decision making, and they are very intolerant of other ideas, like of dissent. But it's also exacerbated by the need to centralise in order to win the civil war. So to have like one leading figure with a strategy to win the civil war. If you think about the main weakness of the White, it was the division of the White armies with many different leaders and many different goals. The Bolsheviks won because they didn't have that, because they had this strong centralisation. One of the key Bolshevik ideas and justifications for their rule was democratic centralism. Now, as the state became more centralised and power was concentrated more in the hands of a very few number of people, that seems to kind of undermine the reasons that the revolution took place. They're claiming all power to the Soviets, who were supposed to be like representatives of the people, were ruling for the people. It's supposed to be more like democratic, in opposition to the Tsar's government, which was just him, wasn't it, in an autocracy. Or it's even supposed to be more representative than the bourgeoisie, which is only representing a small number of middle class individuals, and that's the provisional government, of course. So as they get more centralised, it seems like the Bolsheviks start to betray their own principles and the kind of like founding myth of the Bolshevik state. So they need some way to justify this centralisation of power so that it doesn't look like a total betrayal of all their principles. So what is democratic centralism? Well, let's take that part first. Now, the idea was that towns and villages elected who went into the Soviet, and then representatives from that Soviet would go into the executive committee, and then representatives from the executive committee would go further up the chain. So it's working from the bottom, from the people who elect into that first Soviet, and then up the various levels of government until eventually you'd reach the very top. So in that way, because it comes from the bottom, it's democratic. It's centralist because when orders were being given, so when you're actually carrying out the work of ruling the country, it comes from the top and then it cascades down. Decisions are made at the very top levels and they're passed down to be carried out at the lower levels. So democratic centralism. Finally, let's have a look at the actual naming of Russia in this period. Now, after the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks introduce a new constitution. This happens in 1918, and from that point, the Bolsheviks call Russia the RSFSR, the Russian Soviet Federated Soviet Republic. Now, it's not as big as the Empire of the Tsar because during the Civil War, they lose most of the eastern and southern parts of the old Russian Empire, and of course they've lost them as well during World War I to the Germans. Now, after the Civil War, the Ukraine, Caucasia and Belarus were now created into Bolshevik-controlled Soviet republics, and they signed a treaty of union with Russia. So that's where we get the name, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, from, the USSR. The USSR was only fully up and running from 1924. That's when the constitution came into force. Other Soviet republics did join the USSR later, but it's from 24 that we start to call it the USSR. So as a final consolidation activity today, I'd like you to have a look at the statements on the Word document and to sort them into one of these three categories. These three categories are useful ways of thinking of how the Bolsheviks consolidated their power. So they consolidated power through pragmatic decisions, ruthless methods of terror, staying in control. Can you do this activity now?